I'm Mark Kligman, director of the Lowell Milken Fund for American Jewish Music at UCLA in the Herb Alpert School of Music. And I'm joined with the associate director, Lori Black, and our coordinator and manager, Beth Kramer. And we welcome you to this evening's program. And we've had a series of Jewish music masterclasses. And this is our second to last masterclass for this iteration, and we hope that you'll join us next week for Cantor Benji Ellen Schiller. Tonight, we are pleased to have Bruce Adolphe, who is known by many for his radio programs and many activities, including being a very prolific composer and radio personality. Bruce has made many contributions, and we got to meet a couple years ago at a wonderful project with the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra. So I just want to add one more comment about Bruce, a quote from Itzhak Perlman, who says that Bruce Adolphe is an inspired teacher and a wonderful musician with an unusual ability to translate complex musical concepts into words. So with that, we really look forward to your words and your music, Bruce. So, Bruce Adolphe.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Lowell Milken. Oh, sorry, things are popping in. Thank you to the Lowell Milken Fund for American Jewish Music and UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, and Mark and Lori. It's okay. Sorry, I just got a note saying my meeting is being recorded, and I'm letting it go. Sorry. So I've been a lot of Zooming recently, and it is an extraordinary, phenomenal thing to be doing. It's great to see you all scattered around the country and looking in together. I see people from Texas and New York and Portland, Oregon, and everywhere. It's really extraordinary. I'm going to be talking about several large-scale pieces of music that I've composed on Jewish subjects. And, in your introduction, Mark, when you mentioned the piano posters, there are a lot of people who only know me from the piano posters, so they think I'm always going to be funny. And I am not always funny. In fact, I seem to divide my work into the funny, like the puzzlers, which are a mix of humor and serious music education, and things for children, which are usually funny, but not always. And then a lot of very serious stuff, and a lot of it has to do with either science or human rights. And my Jewish music tends to be human rights-oriented stuff, which is basically what we're going to look at. And I'd like to start with the piece that you know, Mark and Lori, and the piece that's I want to start with is called I Will Not Remain Silent, based on the life of Joachim Prince. And before I even get started with that, I want to say that the title, I Will Not Remain Silent, makes me want to not remain silent and make one statement, which is I want to take this opportunity to say that I am completely in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and against, like Joachim Prince was, all forms of racism in every conceivable way, from the most horrific to the most mundane. And with that said, it's a good way to introduce Joachim Prince. And I'll say this about Joachim Prince. I only know who he was because he is related to my wife's side of the family. My wife, Maria, and her dad, Henry, they're watching this right now. And Henry is related to Joachim Prince. Not terribly closely, but good enough. And I believe that we also have watching this today, probably on Facebook, Joachim Prince's children, Lucy and Jonathan Prince, who there's no other word in English than children, but they're far from children. And I welcome them and hope everything I say lives up to the truth. So I would like to screen share a little bit in order to talk about Joachim Prince and then introduce the piece. And to do that, I'm just going to bring you into my screen. And I hope looks like you are seeing my screen. And let's start with some pictures here. If you can see this, in the large section over here, where my cursor is, this is Joachim Prince, and this is Martin Luther King Jr. Actually, this is Shad Polier, who was a very important civil rights lawyer, also Jewish. And I mention that because Joachim Prince and Shad Polier were very involved in helping African Americans at that time, very involved with Martin Luther King, involved with the Scottsboro Boys. Really, it was a very big tradition of Jewish civil rights-oriented people who had either lived through or because of the Holocaust were very attuned to the crises in America around race. Here's another picture of Joachim Prince and Martin Luther King, and a president that is extremely different from what we think of as a president today, who welcomed them in his office to try to make a better world. And again, Joachim Prince and Martin Luther King Jr. And if you're wondering why are there so many pictures of the two of them together, there they are again. It's harder to see there, so I'll go back. Well, they became good friends and colleagues in the civil rights fight. So Joachim Prince said many important things, and he actually spoke at the March on Washington. Oh, it even says that right here. Right before Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech, Joachim Prince gave a speech in which, among other things, he said the most tragic and the most urgent and the most shameful thing is silence. And he also said he didn't want America to be a nation of onlookers. And all of that's ringing true again today. It always rings true, but especially right at this moment, we're feeling it again. So a violinist named Sharon Rothman came to me wanting a piece. I've known her very well for many years, and she wanted me to write her a major work. And I was thinking a lot about Joachim Prince at the time, and I decided that a violin concerto about him made a lot of sense because the voice of Joachim Prince could be captured in a kind of Jewish-inflected, cantorial-informed, somewhat occasionally Jewish modal music, but very passionate the way a lot of Jewish violin playing is, as his voice. And then the orchestra could be divided into two large movements with Joachim Prince remaining the violin throughout. And the orchestra would represent Nazi Germany in the first movement. And in the second movement, the orchestra would represent America during what we now call the civil rights era. Well, we are right smack in the middle of another civil rights era, but the famous first one, I suppose. And Sharon gave the world premiere with Mikhoels Stern, who happens to be Isaac Stern's son, but he is a great musician in his own right, conducting the Iris Orchestra, which is right near Memphis, which of course made the whole relationship to Martin Luther King very powerful. And we did a lot of educational outreach related to that fact. Then the piece really took off, and it was played by Musicians for Human Rights, which has an orchestra, the Human Rights Orchestra. They played it in Lucerne, and the soloist was Ilya Gringolz, who actually both Sharon and Ilya are students of Itzhak Perlman, who you mentioned earlier. And it was conducted by Alessio Allegrini. And then it was performed by Daniel Hope, and that was the one, Mark, that you referred to, performed in LA with the LA Chamber Orchestra conducted by Jeff Kahane. And this particular set of performances, there were two, caused much more of a stir than I had ever expected, because the piece, I Will Not Remain Silent, with its political message and powerful social justice mood, was performed that weekend that Trump was inaugurated, and during the Women's March, there was a rehearsal, and a lot of the people in the Women's March showed up at the concert. And Jeff Kahane read from the Constitution. It was a remarkable event. And of course, the piece had already been played twice and was written a few years before. I had no idea that it was going to appear in such a circumstance, but it got a lot of attention, as if I suddenly wrote the piece as soon as Trump was elected, or seemed to be elected, And there was a lot of press asking, how did this happen? And I just had to explain that it was a coincidence, and it was not a happy one, because I was writing the piece in memory of a great person and a great situation of the speech on March on Washington and the hope that it inspired, and not because I felt it was necessary to do it again. And then, of course, everything's changed. And then the piece was performed again by Daniel in Germany. And when it was performed in Germany, there were lots and lots of questions from the audience not about the piece and not about Joachim Prince, but they asked me, how could Trump have gotten elected? Just because I was an American, so I was forced to try to deal with that question. I think we'll talk about this kind of thing a little bit together, but first maybe I'll get to the music and play some of it for you. I thought I'd play some highlights, and then we could talk, and then I'll play a movement. So highlight-wise, now I'm going to skip to where the piece begins. By the way, this performance, after Daniel Hope played it in Germany, it was played in Texas, in Houston, by ROCO, which is the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, which is run by Alicia Lawyer, different Alicia. And Alicia Lawyer invited me after this piece to be their composer in residence, and I wrote the other Jewish piece that I hope to get to on this program. And the violinist was Scott St. John, and the conductor was again Michael Stern. So I'm going to skip the very opening and play a little bit of highlights. So if I can find a minute and 46 seconds. Sorry about that. Well, now you know how it opens. A minute 40. Okay, you're about to hear a bit of this violin cadenza. I'm sorry, there doesn't seem to be any other way to move this forward silently on SoundCloud. You will hear a little bit of this very Jewish-inflected solo, and then I'm going to move it further into that. And you will be hearing basically the orchestra as a highly Jewishly inflected instrument. I mean, the violin is a highly Jewishly inflected instrument surrounded by violence in the orchestra. I'm only going to stop it so we can hear some highlights. We will play the whole thing. A little bit further on, some violent outbursts against the violin. Okay, so I'm just going to stop it. So I'll play. Mark, I can see you. Is it okay if I play this entire movement after I say a few things? Hello? Mark? Oh, yes.
Up to you, Bruce.
Oh, okay. All All right. Well, it's about 8.5 minutes. So I'll introduce it a little more and say I think we must have music students and musicians there. So I'll say a little bit more about it. One of the things I wanted to portray in the orchestra is the mechanistic and inexorable feeling of the Nazi plan. And the way to do that, I thought, among others, was to rhythmically structure a series of rhythmic crescendos. In other words, increase rhythmic density within a space divided up polymetrically. So what that means is the percussion is actually going faster and faster in a very specific mathematical, methodical manner, which is paying no attention to what's going on around it, which is basically a metaphor for what was happening. So there was a mathematical precision to what goes on in the percussion at certain places that is basically destroying the music around it. That's one thing. Another is that the violin is attacked by the entire orchestra at the end of the movement. And the statement that I'm trying to make is that the violin's sense of hope and the violin's mission is not destroyed. And so the violin, as you'll hear at the end of the movement, remains floating in the air, playing very high notes, while the orchestra literally tries to kill it. That's what it sounds like. I mean, it is shooting, the orchestra is kind of shooting bullets at the violin. There are also Jewish elements in the orchestra in order to portray the idea of scattering, fleeing, running, and fear. So while you have Nazi elements in the orchestra, you also have a kind of Jewish community occasionally. I think it's pretty obvious where that happens. So I hope you're okay with this, folks. I'm going to play you the first movement of this piece. Here we go. I'll go back to the beginning, and then we'll do it. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share so we can talk a little bit more easily. So that was the first movement of I Will Not Remain Silent, where the violin represents Joachim Prince. And that particular performance was Scott St. John soloist with the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra Rocco in Houston, conducted by Michael Stern. You know, I have to say, before we get into a conversation, it's amazing to me that I have 5 different violinists have played and recorded that, and they're all great performances. It's really hard to figure out which one to play. But there you have it. They're all incredible. Does anybody wish to make a comment or ask a question? I can happily try to deal with that. Or I could move forward.
May I ask a question?
Yes. Who is talking?
This is Jeff. This is Jeff Janesco.
Oh, Jeff, great. Yeah.
I mean, I know the work a little bit from having talked with you about it in the past, but I wanted to ask you a very musical question, which was how you constructed the melody, because there was it seemed somewhere in between kind of tonality and atonality, and it was sort of floating out there apart from the orchestral music that you had mentioned was kind of fighting against it. So maybe you could talk a little about just how you put that together.
I can. Jeff, it's one of those questions where you actually answered your question in the question. I mean, it is partially tonal and partially atonal, and it's working against what the orchestra is playing. But I'll try to go further than what you said. I had a picture of you, and I've lost you here. But anyway, you know, I did not look at or flip through books of Jewish music or cantorial music or Jewish folk music or klezmer or anything. First of all, klezmer, not at all, because it doesn't really relate to Joachim Prince. I wanted it to be more of a religious sounding. And he was a rabbi, but his world was really secular humanism and people and humanity first. He was not one of these chosen people rabbis. But I grew up with so much Jewish music that I didn't need to flip through books. I had it in my head. I've always had it in my head. In fact, I hum a lot, and my wife is always telling me that I'm humming fragments of prayers, and I don't ever sing any of them or even think about it. So that's how ingrained it must be. So when I was working on this piece, I do what I always do, which is I divide my working process into 2 categories that I call dreaming and thinking. I sort of dream the piece, but this is awake. I'm not asleep, and I'm following it. I'm very consciously, deliberately allowing my imagination to proceed without my interfering. That's a feeling we all know. And I follow that, and then when I start to organize it into something to compose with, then I get into the thinking, which is more, I wouldn't exactly call it editorial, but it's more selective and full of rejecting ideas. So in doing that, these religious and Jewish and folk Jewish melodies, and also tunes I knew from other works I've worked on. I mean, I had already written 2 major Jewish operas, and also an oratorio based on songs and of the Holocaust, where some of the tunes were written by victims and survivors. So all of that was ringing in my head, and I took fragments. And again, I didn't write down fragments and use them. I heard a kind of collage or dream of Jewish fragmented melodic units. And then I strung them together in a kind of non-tonal. I wouldn't exactly call it atonal, because the continuum of tonality and atonality is more interesting than the separation. Just like the continuum of races in the world is more interesting than divisions into black, white, and whatever you may have. The divisions are meaningless. It's the continuum that matters. So the continuum as a metaphor of modality and tonality and chromaticism and atonality, that is all part of the vocabulary of expressive music. So I don't have any boundaries there. It's clear that the atonal or the non-tonal or the heavily chromatically inflected music is more complex sounding and has more emotional complexity and can be more disturbing than something that is modal and more old and has a kind of ancient quality to it. Against that, the orchestra, I actually deliberately, in this case, allowed myself to think about composers who were alive during the Nazi regime. And some of that kind of music made its way into the piece, which gives it a kind of realism. It's like if you're building a set for a theater piece or a movie, and you want it to be real, you may have to actually use some recognizable imagery from that time. And in a way, I've used recognizable sonic imagery from that world as a set for this piece. So that's basically what it is. I hope that answered your question wherever you are, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking that. It's one of my favorite topics. Is there another question before I move on to another piece? You know, I'm used to looking around a classroom. I'm not able to do that right now, so I have no idea if somebody is thinking about saying something. Okay, well, I'll go on a little bit then. The next piece, by the way, there is another movement to that piece that takes place in America, but I figured in the time we have, I'll move on. Also, if you want to hear the whole piece, there are many places to hear it. One is on the ROCO website, the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, where the exact performance you were hearing. Another is Sharon Rothman's website, and some of the other performances are harder to find. One of the LA Chamber Orchestra, which was a spectacular performance with Jeff Kahane and Daniel Hope, I have it, but I can't legally broadcast that. So I'm sorry, I can't do that, but maybe one day I will be able to. So the next piece is called I Too Bleed and Hope for Beauty. Now, that is quite a mouthful. And I didn't make up the title, I chose it. And it was said by Manka Svalbova. I have to look at her name over here. She was a nurse, or actually a Slovak doctor functioning in Auschwitz, who became a friend of Alma Rosé, who was a violinist who is unfortunately known for having run the women's orchestra in Auschwitz. Before that, she was part of the royalty of Vienna, musical royalty, and of Europe. She was the daughter of Arnold Rosé, a great and famous violinist who was concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and also a member of the first Rosé Quartet, which had two, he was also married to one of Mahler's sisters, and Arnold Rosé's brother was married to the other of Mahler's sisters. So that meant that Alma Rosé, who was named after Alma Mahler, was the niece of Gustav Mahler, the daughter of Alma Rosé, and a violinist herself who started a very lightweight, fun orchestra. Now I'm going to screen share so you can see this picture. Here, where my cursor is on the right of the screen, it says Alma Rosé con le sue Vina Valde Medlen, sorry, Vina Valse Medlen. Sorry about that. Alma Rosé, that's her name. And obviously we are in Italy, con le sue, and then the name of it, the Viennese Valse Mädel, the Waltzing Maidens of Vienna. And there they are. There's Alma Rosé in the middle. These are all pictures of her. She played lighter music and found a career touring Europe that way. But then, of course, when the Nazis came to power, being Jewish, even though she was part of an incredibly important family related to Gustav Mahler, it meant nothing. Of course, it meant absolutely nothing whatsoever. And she was arrested eventually. It's a long story, but she ended up in Auschwitz, where she managed to be the leader of what we call the Auschwitz Orchestra, the women's orchestra. But it was not an orchestra. It was a very tiny group of players. And they survived. Everyone who played survived because that was the only music that could be heard. And for the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, I wrote 3 pieces about women who survived the Holocaust or almost survived the Holocaust in the case of Alma Rosé because of music. Alma Rosé, I wrote a chamber orchestra piece, I Too Bleed and Hope for Beauty, which was, I didn't finish my sentence, that was said by Manka Svalbova when she described hearing Alma Rosé's violin. She said, the violin sounds like it is saying, I too bleed and hope for beauty. So I also wrote 2 pieces, chamber works for Rocco. One is about Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who is still alive. I think she's 95, living in London, one of the founders of the English Chamber Orchestra, a cellist. And the other died rather recently at age 110, Alice Herzoma, who was a pianist who was in Theresienstadt. So in this piece, I don't know that I should play the entire work. I'll play some of it. It's for chamber orchestra. It was conducted here by Alistair Willis. I again told the story through the music. And again, there's some violence, but it's a different set of ideas. There is a little bit of reference to waltz music because of her, including one very brief, eerie, strange, isolated quote of the Vienna Woods. But the feeling here is of a kind of nostalgia and a clinging to music, and music as a rock to hold on to. You might say music as the consonance where the rest of the world is dissonance. And that's kind of how I thought about it. So I'll play a few moments of it. Oh, by the way, I also want to say that I didn't announce this at the premiere, but the musicians knew that there is a quote in the piece of Traumlerei of Schumann. And the quote is very distorted and a little bit hard to hear. And the reason I put that in there is not because of Alma Rosé, but because of Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, the cellist, who was actually playing in the orchestra at Auschwitz. She was forced to play that tune over and over and over and over until she almost dropped by one Nazi officer who said he liked the tune and made her just sit there and play it until she could not play anymore. And so I put that in to the score in a very distorted manner. So I'll play the opening of this piece and then move around in it a little bit. Now I'm going to stop it for a moment and go to, because of time, I'm going to play a few highlights. I'm going to go to where the distorted traumarai comes in. And if you don't know the tune, don't worry about it. You can tell that there's a straight ahead melody passed through the orchestra that is being distorted. You could always look up traumarai. It's part of Kindersehnen of Schumann. I'm going to find that spot for you. That. I'm going to move to a spot where there's what a musician would call a hocket. It's like the word hiccup. It's a medieval technique. And I wanted to make the audience feel, and actually the musicians feel this way playing this, like they are caught in a machine, cogs in a wheel. And a hocket is the division of a single line into multiple parts. It could just be 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, but here it's many, many parts. So they're actually only playing one melody, but it's so divided up and people hold on to their parts. So it sounds like a machine and everyone is a cog in the wheel. So again, it's a metaphor. I love coming up with, obviously you've probably glommed onto the idea that for me, I find musical parallels and metaphors for saying exactly what I want to say if I can possibly do. Just to move forward, and you can hear this whole piece also on the Rocco website. Obviously, that's where I'm playing it from, SoundCloud related to that website. I want to play the ending because sometimes trying to find a musical parallel to an idea gives me what feels like, I'm not sure it is, but feels like a brand new musical idea, concept even. I'm not saying they are, but I know a lot of music, and I sometimes feel like this I don't think I've heard before, this idea. And it's only because I'm trying to say something in particular. And so near the very, very end of this piece, I wanted to give the simultaneous feeling of hope and despair. The people holding on to hope within Auschwitz, those who could, especially someone like Alma Rosé. But the fact is, it doesn't work out for most. And so how do you do that musically? I'm not going to describe it. I'm going to play the very ending for you, and then I'll describe it if I think it makes more sense to do that. I hope you could hear that. I hope that was really audible because it's very, very quiet. But at the very end, there's a harmony with the violin way on top in most of the orchestra. And then it fades away and you realize that underneath it is another harmony in another key. And it's a minor chord and it's very dark and deep. And you didn't know it was there because it appears very quietly. And as the hopeful music disappears, you're left with that. And to me, the whole piece, working on the whole piece became that for me, that a discovery of being able to say what I meant. So we have a little bit of time. I would love to hear a comment or a question from somebody. I know I'm approaching the end of the time. I see that people may be chatting here. Oh.
Both pieces are just gorgeous. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you. Who is talking?
Ben.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. Anybody have a question or want to just touch base, say hello?
Hey, Bruce. It's Alicia.
Hi, Alicia. Alicia Lawyer there is the director of Rocco and the oboist you heard. And Alicia, again, thank you for commissioning that piece and the other two pieces and having me be your composer in residence. It's a really great experience. And obviously those recordings are beautiful.
Hi, Bruce. Rami.
Oh, where are you?
I'm in New Rochelle. I'm on somewhere on this big list of names here. Can you see me?
Well, I have to scroll around like crazy to find you.
You know what I look like.
I do.
I loved both pieces, and I was in that first piece. You have the violin. It's battling all those Nazis in the orchestra, and yet it never sounded weak. There was a strength in it in the writing, which I found beautiful, and was curious if it was something you were doing consciously, or whether I just am imagining it or noticing it.
No, well, you're totally right, and I think that part of it comes from the fact that I needed the orchestra to be scary. And so occasionally that meant loud, quite a lot, and also full of outbursts and certain amount of unpredictability, as well as the opposite of unpredictability, which is an encroaching, inexorable kind of sense of doom. And to have a violinist play over that meant that I had to generally write extremely high, not always, but a lot of the times very high and forte, which is about strength and power. And every violinist immediately got what that was about and really dug into it. It was very rewarding. I say 5 great violinists have played this, and I was extremely thrilled by that. Thanks, Rami.
Hey, Bruce, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Aubrey Lurie. I'm calling you from Louisiana.
Ah, no wonder you have such a strong Southern accent.
That's right. Very good. I have been a fan of yours for years, mainly from the Wednesday Piano Puzzler. And I don't know how I stumbled onto this program, but what an eye-opener it's been for me. I've always considered you to be brilliant, and now I know that you are. And
thank you.
It's amazing. I'm just staggered by your depth of knowledge and your talent and your ability to do the Piano Puzzler every week. It's amazing. So it's been an absolute delight for me to stumble on this. I don't know how I found it, but I've been fiddling around in all these terrible times that we're living through, and what a find this has been for me. I don't even know what program you appear on or anything. So if I wanted to find you again, I don't think I would be able to.
Well, at the moment, the only regular thing I'm doing is still there doing archive performances of the Piano Puzzlers. I have a website, which is just my name, where I would say normally I post concerts and performances, but most of them have been canceled, of course, because of the pandemic. So, but that is where you would find things. Plus, I do work at the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, where they have a website, and many of the things that I've done for them are posted and archived, including children's concerts, lectures, and some of my composing are all there at Lincoln Center. Thank you for those comments. Thank you very much.
Well, that's great. I'll just tell you one little incident these last few months have done for me. I'm a physician at a VA hospital, and things have been pretty tough there. Guyana hasn't really been so severely affected as the rest, like New York, for example. But one of the things I've had to do in order to keep my sanity is go through my big collection of CDs and vinyl records and just play music the whole time, which I do in my spare time when I come home. And, you know, some of this music is so familiar for me because I've been listening to it for years and years and years, that I feel that it's part of my body. I feel as if I'm discovering a toe or a limb or something that I hadn't paid much attention to.
That's great. I love that.
And it's been an incredible experience. I'm just, obviously, I'm a purist in a way. I love the romantics, the Mendelssohn, Brahms, Mozart era sort of thing. But I also love everything else. And I'm Jewish like everybody else. And, and you know, the music that I grew up in Africa, and the music was traditional cantorial music, Lithuanian style. And it was such an important part of my family. My mother and my father came from Lithuania. I'll tell you one tale. During when the First World War broke out, she and her family were sent across the whole extent of Russia to Siberia. They came from Lithuania, and they were shipped in cattle trucks. And one day, when she saw the film, one of the Holocaust movies, the people riding in, she completely lost her bearing. She was back as a 6-year-old, or whatever it was, in that cattle truck. It was the most amazing experience for her. At any rate, she grew up in Siberia, really, spent a few years there, but came out of it back to Lithuania and then to Africa with a real love for the Russian language and Russian music and ballet. And it was the most interesting experience for me to grow up in that environment. And here we are. Here now I'm paying homage to somebody I admire very much. I think you're an absolute genius. And I just wish I could continue listening to this sort of talk forever and ever.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You know, I just want to say one thing. When you said it's like discovering part of your body, my friend Antonio Damasio, who's a very well-known neuroscientist, always says that everything a human experiences is something done to the body. And that even what we think of as our mind is, you know, a brain, which is an organ in the body. And that all our experiences are done to us from the outside.
Yes.
So
How
there's
interesting.
a lot of truth to that. I see a lot of people have asked me questions on chats, and I'm sorry I didn't answer all of them, but they look good. Good questions. So I have a feeling we're approaching the end of the time. Are we not? Or
no, we can certainly keep going a little longer. We just so feel free to answer the questions in the chat.
Okay, yeah, I could do that. I can answer the questions in the chat. I'll do that. A lot of very beautiful comments from quite a few people. And someone asked me how I chose the instruments in the last piece. I'm hearing somebody's room very loudly. You might want to mute yourself.
Sorry, I'm at the ocean. I will.
Okay. And I wanted to answer that question about the orchestration. Is that, I mean, I used the orchestration of the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, but the question also wants to know about the percussion in the piece. And the percussion was serving the purpose, especially the marimba, both of this strange duality of the heartbeat and the opposite of a heartbeat, which is a mechanistic fate. And they have something strangely in common, that pulse. So I thought I would throw that in there as an answer because it was a good question. I feel like an hour is a long time, and I know that you've been listening mostly with headphones on for a very long time. So, Mark, I think I want to thank you for inviting me to do this, and it was a real pleasure. I feel like I could come do it every week. It's really, really fun and interesting. If there's one last comment from someone, that would be fine, but I'm okay with saying that I think I've played enough music for you and said basically what I came to say.
So we'd be happy to take one final question.
Your website's Bruce Adolphe.
Yes.
BruceAdolphe.com.
That is correct, BruceAdolphe.com. That's a really good question. That's like at children's concerts. You ask for a question and a kid says, "My brother plays the trumpet." My favorite question.
Benji Schiller has a question.
Yes.
Happy to ask it.
Hi, this is my husband Les's question. Go ahead, honey.
I'm just here because I'm with her. Anyway, my question. I'm a music lover. About you see that that the Prince piece, which I'm going to be listening to in my mind for weeks to come, very powerful. At certain points, made me think of some of these moments in some of these pieces that were retrieved by these composers who died very young, like Teresa and elsewhere, who are Janacek students. There's a whole school of Janacek students.
Yes.
And I couldn't help thinking that I bet you know all those pieces, and you know the names of those composers. I don't, but that you were channeling them a little bit. You had to, because it's all of Joachim Prince's yichus, it's his connection. So
that is a fabulous comment. And part of, first of all, yes, I do know a lot of those pieces. But the other thing is I consider myself a Janacek student. Seriously.
See?
And the reason I can describe that very simply, which is the thing that Janacek brought to music was a kind of, Beethoven did it first and then nobody did it again until Janacek, which is a kind of emotional realism where the composer does not want to use any notes or phrases or anything that is not part of the message. So it is a kind of expressionism in a way, but it's different than Schoenberg. It's completely different because there's no, it's not a technical approach. It's a purely emotional approach, which results in technical phenomena. And that means that if you want to, like I've been saying, you want to say this, you find the way to say it. And you come up with a metaphor in the music that you may have never used in another piece and may never use again. And also some of the rhythmic and especially in the last piece, some of the use of the marimba, etc., might remind someone of Janufa, of Janacek. And that is because the first time I heard that, it was something done to my body to put this all together, and I've never been able to get rid of it. So I use it when it's necessary. Thank you for bringing that up. That's very perceptive.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We really appreciate your presentation, and really very, very enlightening. And it's just wonderful to hear your music. We thank you all for joining us tonight, and we invite you to join us again next week, where we will be joined by Cantor Benji Ellen Schiller, the creative wife of the person who just asked the last question. So we look forward to all of you joining us. And again, thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to answer these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
We can all unmute ourselves and give a real round of applause.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, really.